Hey, thanks for joining us. We're talking about the case for the resurrection of Jesus. I'm joined by Michael Kona. I'm Michael Patton here at the Credo House. So if you've been wondering what all this background is behind you, this is the Credo House, our coffee shop and theological event center here in Edmond, Oklahoma. But we're talking about what we believe to be, Mike, the central doctrine, the central element of faith of Christianity, and that is the resurrection of Jesus, or the central event that establishes Christianity more than anything else, and that's the resurrection of Christ. So far we've been through, and we have tried to plead with you, saying walk with us on this journey, because it's such an important journey to walk on, and that we can actually, as Christians, walk this road called history, this road called come and see, this road called, as God had said, use your minds, stop and think. And we're continuing to use our minds, hopefully, by saying, can we establish the resurrection? Can we say with confidence that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened? On this last DVD, during this last time session, we want to cover a few other things. We've already talked about what the sources, what's the historical method? What are the sources we have to draw from with regard to the resurrection? What are the things that the sources say? And then what are some alternatives to that? We said that, I think the best thing that we said last time in conclusion was that every other alternative besides the resurrection for the data that we have as historians is requires us to take a greater leap of faith than just believing the resurrection. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, so much so that we said that unless you start with the presupposition that God can't and won't and doesn't raise people from the grave, then the resurrection is a shoo-in historically. I mean, that's what we have to go to. Am I good so far?
Absolutely.
Although there's going to be some people who come and have, I guess you would say, typical questions, typical, and I think sincere, hands raised, and they say, okay, wait a minute. Okay, I see what you've said so far, but what about, say, the different accounts in the New Testament? What about the contradictions in the Bible? Doesn't it seem like, Matthew tells one story, Mark tells another, and Luke tells another? Yeah, they may be agreement on many things, but there's just these weird things, like how many people showed up at the tomb? How many women showed up at the tomb? Well, how do we handle as historians these types of discrepancies?
Well, there's a number of things we can do. First of all, I'd want to point out that the historical bedrock we've discussed, all of those can be arrived at via the letters of Paul. And Paul writes his letters prior to any of the Gospels. And so even if the Gospels contained all sorts of errors and contradictions for the purposes of a historical investigation of the resurrection, it wouldn't matter a whole lot because they come after, they postdate Paul's letters. So it's kind of like the later Gnostic literature. It doesn't matter if they're problematic because we have better literature before them that we look at. So again, even if all the canonical Gospels had problems, you still got Paul's letters and the early oral tradition that's embedded in those. So that's one thing I'd say.
Okay, so number one, put this in perspective. Paul's letters establish it even if these were not even in existence.
That's correct.
Okay.
All right. Second, I would say that got to look at how valuable or how much damage contradictions in the Gospels would actually cause. You have things such as when the Titanic sank, you had certain survivors that said, they said that the Titanic broke in half prior to sinking. Others said, no, the Titanic went down in one piece. How do you get that wrong? You're out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There's nothing there except this object in front of you, if you're in a lifeboat, object in front of you that's a little over 800 feet long. It's all lit up and you hear screams coming from it. You have friends and family and colleagues that are dying that evening, so you're just really somber. You're terrified. And so that's really the only thing you're looking at that point. And some people said she broke in half and then sank. Others said, no, she went down in half. I don't know how they got it wrong, but I do know this. Nobody turned around and said, well, I guess the Titanic didn't sink. Because the discrepancy, the contradiction was in a peripheral detail. So at work, I can say this. I have studied contradictions or differences in the Gospels for the last 3.5 years. It's my next research project. I've made over 40 pages of differences that I've found in the Gospels through my reading them over the last 3.5 years. I can tell you that All the differences that I have found are in the peripheral details. I haven't found a single difference in any of the main, the core of what happened. So in other words, there may be discrepancies on whether Simon of Cyrene carried Jesus' cross all the way or whether Jesus did. Easily reconciled, but let's say even if you couldn't. Or did both thieves curse Jesus or just one? Did Jesus die was he crucified at 9 a.m. or noon? Was he crucified the day of the Passover meal or the day after the Passover meal? These are discrepancies, they're differences within the peripheral details. Nobody turns around and says, well, I guess Jesus wasn't crucified and died. So all the discrepancies or differences within the Gospels are within the peripheral
What
details.
you're saying, whenever you say nobody says that, you're saying nobody, number one, should say that, and historians can't say that, otherwise you'll be disqualified as a historian. Because if you look in history and you say, all right, I'm only going to accept that history, which number one has parallel accounts, more than one account, and number two, none of these have any discrepancies at all.
You're going to have to throw out all of history.
We're done.
I mean, something simple as the burning of Rome, which took place, it started on July 18th in the year 64. We have three chief sources that report the burning of Rome. You have Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dionysius. His name is eluding me at this point. Dio Cassius, that's it. All three of these differ on whether the Emperor Nero secretly enlisted thugs to torch the city, or did he do it openly, or was he not involved at all in enlisting thugs to do it? They disagree on that. They disagree on the extent of the fire. They disagree on whether Nero watched the fire from his palace rooftop, from the Tower of Maecenas, or from 35 miles away from Rome in the city of Antium. All of them disagree on these things, and yet no one turns around and says, well, I guess they're all wrong and Rome didn't burn. So they got the peripheral details, some of them got it wrong, but they're right on with the core. So a professional historian is going to look at the differences. They're not considering an issue such as the inspiration or the inerrancy of a text. That is a doctrine of faith, and I'm saying apart from any kind of doctrine of inerrancy or inspiration, a historian has to look at the biblical text for what we know it certainly is, a collection of 27 books and letters from the first century that the Christians regarded as authoritative. You can't take into account that it's inspired or inerrant, or else you just say, well, it's all true and we're done. We don't have to do a historical investigation. If we're looking to prove something, to see what we can prove or arrive at historically, we can't give any consideration to the divine quality of a text. And so in terms of the differences in the Gospels, even if they turned out to be contradictions, I haven't seen any major ones or anything like that. Again, any differences are in the peripheral details. But even if there were, these were irreconcilable in these peripheral details, no historian is going to look at that and say these events didn't occur because of these differences.
The Titanic didn't sink. The city of Rome didn't burn.
Right.
Jesus didn't rise from the grave because we got one little discrepancy that we can't figure out. I mean, that's a huge deal. But another thing that is interesting and I think is very important for us to recognize as trying to be historians is that you don't necessarily want them to be parallel exactly, right? I mean, whenever you have different accounts and they're nuanced according to their own purposes, then you understand that these are independent accounts, not stuff where we said, hey, let me just do exactly what the next person did. It's kind of like if we had 4 Gospels and somebody looks at them and say, hey, they're different, so therefore they're wrong. And then you would say, okay, do you want there to be 4 exact Gospels, where the exact same things, just different titles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the same words.
Yeah, but the difference is, and often you hear people describe it as like a car accident. Different witnesses see it in different ways, but you don't want necessarily contradictory details, at least in the major things. So yeah, they're telling it by different ways, but I think one way that this can be explained is each historian is telling some things differently, as you would say. They're focusing on different things. So for example, when Mark says that both thieves cursed him and Luke says one repented, this could easily be reconciled by saying when the crucifixions first took place, both thieves were cursing him. And then as the one thief watched Jesus suffer patiently and righteously, toward the end of the day when he knew his life was about to end, He says, Lord, he's convinced about Jesus and who he is now seeing him suffer, and he repents. That's reconcilable. It's not necessarily a contradiction, it's a difference, and that can be viewed that way. And just about all the differences that we find can be explained away in terms of that kind of harmonization without any problem whatsoever.
Yeah, and that's what you just expect in any account.
Others could be paraphrasing, summarizing. Ancient biographers did things that way. So they weren't committed to the same kind of punctilious accuracy that we expect today in writing modern history. And we have to recognize that. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not form a committee for the misleading of future historians. They are writing according to the literary conventions of their day, and biography allowed you some flexibilities that you can do, and that's why they do time compression, and their chronology is different between the Gospels and so forth. But that wouldn't have been considered contradictions for them.
Let's talk about something else. Talk about contradictions, but let's also talk about an objection that is often made that the Christ story is based upon other myths that have gone before it. Myths of dying and rising gods, and so therefore all Christianity is simply a reincarnation of these myths. How do we respond to that? As a historian, how do you respond to that?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, it's very difficult to identify a story or report of a dying and rising hero or god that predates Christianity, predates the Gospels. They all seem to postdate the Gospels. So if anyone's copying, who's copying? Now there's a senior Swedish scholar named T.N.D. Medinger that I think 2001, 2002 came out with a book titled The Riddle of Resurrection. And in there he acknowledges that there's nearly a universal consensus that all of these parallels postdate the Gospels. But he takes exception with it. He says there are 3 and perhaps as many as 5 that predate Christianity. He does kind of strain some with these. And like, for example, just in the case of Baal, we've heard of Baal, right? It's the storm god. And he has this nemesis, a brother named Mot, who is the god of the netherworld. And Baal is the god of the storms and is upstairs. So they're always trash-talking each other, and then one day Mot says, come on, leave your wind, your storms behind, come on down to the netherworld and I'll show you who's your daddy. So Baal decides to do that. He goes down and Mot swallows him. And one day Baal's mom and dad are talking and they said, Baal's dead. Well, how do we know this? Well, because it's not raining. It was there to, this story was invented in order to explain the drought in the summer. And then, so Baal's mom goes down to the netherworld, forces Mot to regurgitate him. But how do they know that he's alive again? Because it's raining. So it's just like when we were kids and our parents told us that thunder is angels bowling in heaven. That's what we're looking at here. And, this is something that was supposed to occur in the distant past. It's not meant to be understood as historical. But the resurrection occurred within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. It's not in the distant past, unnamed past. So even the examples he gives aren't convincing to show that this is what the Christians would do. And I would say, there's much more that we could say on this, but let me say this and we can talk some more about it. But what are the chances when you've got the Christians who are debating over, can we eat meat sacrificed to idols? Do Gentile Christian males need to be circumcised in order to be a Christian continuation of Judaism? Can Jewish Christians eat with Gentile Christians? How much of the law do we have to still follow? When they're arguing over these things, what are the chances that they're going to do wholesale borrowing from the pagan mystery religions for the core foundation of Christianity, that Jesus died and rose from the dead? It's very unlikely.
Yeah, that's a good point. And another thing is, whenever I look at this and begin to, you read Homer's Iliad and you read some of these other things that are ancient, kind of where you draw these parallels from. But like you said, I mean, there's a whole different genre of material that we're dealing with, isn't it? I mean, first of all, to qualify for history, And to make the claim for history, at least you have to make a claim, don't you, of some sort, like this is what happened in this year, and then you can start building from there as a historian. But as a historian, you might look at these things, the Baal and the Zeus and the Hercules and all these kind of other things that you might look at. You say, you know what? There's not a type of literature, a genre of belief that this fits into that ever even claims historicity. Therefore, it's not even a question of whether or not Christianity borrowed from this, because Christianity borrows from what we say impacted in time in Jesus Christ, God making a footprint and telling times, dates, and that's why we can write 700 pages worth of material on whether or not this actually happened, because you test the times, you test the dates, you test the people, you test the manuscripts, and so on.
Well, you think about, too, even Medgar, Whitman, all these other dying and rising figures, they are there to celebrate the changing of the seasons, their agricultural cycles, okay? When it comes to Christianity, you've got the Apostle Paul saying, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You have the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 saying, if Christ has not been raised, then the dead aren't raised. And if the dead aren't raised, that is believers in the final day at the judgment of God, then let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Everything they were linking to the resurrection, because they believed it was an event that occurred in history, not in the past history, but within their lifetimes that there were eyewitnesses for. This is completely different than someone talking about the agricultural cycles. And let me also say this, there's with these guys like Dionysus and so many of these others that they claim, there are all these, like he was born on December 25th, he crucified between two thieves and rose 3 days later. A lot of those are just bogus.
Yeah.
There is no evidence, like Dionysus, there's no, he was crucified. There's no stories of him being crucified. The December 25th is the birth of Jesus. That was made up by the Christians in like the 3rd century or 4th century. That's when it first appeared. Had nothing to do with the 1st century Jesus. You usually have to combine 2, 3, or 4 of these ancient figures and the parallels there to come up with one Jesus, to have all these details. So a lot of the details are false. You got to combine. There's so many problems with the parallels.
And it's so built upon hearsay. Somebody that you may be listening to this and you're objecting, you've heard that before. It's just parallels. Have you really studied the parallels? Have you really looked at the sources themselves and seen yourself that these are parallels that you would draw from them, and gone through the same type of historical inquiry that we're going through right here? And I guarantee most everybody would say, no, actually I haven't. I just heard that on a popular DVD or some debate or something like that. Whenever you compare them, it's apples and oranges. And that's what we've been trying to do here with this. This is about history. This is about taking our faith and putting it through this filter of history and testing it. Why? Because we believe God is that big, that He makes that big of a footprint, and that He cares that much for you. That He cares so much that He doesn't come and become incarnate and go in hiding and say, let me get a few secret followers and don't tell anybody about this, and it's going to be a secret religion and we'll pass it on in a secret way. It's a public event. God is a public God. He loves people. He loves everybody, and that's why He makes this huge, huge footprint. And He says, come and see, please come and see. And that's why we're so excited that you were able to come here and talk to us about this, because this is the revolution we're trying to have with the gospel. We want people to believe in it deeply. Briefly, what do you say about the implications of this? What do you say to somebody out there that's, number one, the first person listening to this, is a believer, and says, what do you want me to do with this, Mike? Number two, the person out there that still remains skeptical and says, yeah, but.
Well, I'd say to the believer, I hope that you can see that we believe by faith, but it is a reasonable faith that we believe. There's a lot of good evidence. We don't have to check our mind at the doors, when being a Christian. It is not a stubborn faith. It is not an uninformed faith. It is a faith based on solid historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And what this tells us is that we really do matter to God. God does care for us. We can, if you're going through a tough time right now, maybe you lost your job, maybe you've lost a loved one, maybe your family's just kind of blown up in different relationships, maybe you're having financial struggles, maybe you just found out a bad diagnosis and you only have a certain amount of time left. or things are going to get really difficult. Maybe you've just been involved in a car accident. You've become paralyzed to an extent. What the resurrection of Jesus tells us is that God really does love us. This is just a testing ground, this life. There is much more to come. There's an eternity with the Lord to be enjoyed. And this is a testing ground for us. We can endure this time because we know the dead are raised and that we are going to enjoy an eternity with God, and that this can be encouraging for us through the difficult times. If you're a non-believer, then I hope what this does is it challenges you to give a little more thought to the Christian faith. The Christian faith is not a matter of church. We know there's a lot of hypocrites in church. Gosh, there are bad examples in any worldview, even atheism. All you have to do is look at Mao, Pol Pot, Stalin, and Kim Jong-il. But you can't judge a philosophy by its abuse. Jesus loved others. Jesus promises eternal life, forgiveness of sins, and an intimate relationship with God can be obtained through Jesus Christ. If He rose from the dead, then the gospel message that Jesus proclaimed about the kingdom and Himself is true. And this is the greatest news that the world could ever know. I want to challenge you to give this some thought, to give a thought to the gospel that Jesus preached and the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, which would verify the truth of that message.
We appreciate you joining us for the last few weeks, and we pray that this has been beneficial to you and that it will establish you deeply in the faith and the centrality of the resurrection and let you leave here today saying it is really true.